It's over, it's finally over. We're looking at the last issue of the Sally miniseries, and I could not be happier to have this one over and done with. This miniseries has been a massive waste of time. This ending does nothing to save the first two issues, and all we got out of it was the first romantic plot tumor of the comic, and a bunch of characters we don't care about that wouldn't return for about 150 issues. Cover's good at least. That's something I can't really fault this mini for. The covers in general are gorgeous, and this one isn't an exception. It just looks really cool, and it paints a vivid picture with some wonderful colors, but it also lies, big time. While the last two covers were at least kind of based around scenes and events that take place within their books, this one isn't. This promises an epic confrontation between Sally and her doppelganger, and that Sally will wear a jetpack. Neither happens in this story, and I am severely disappointed in both fronts. I've basically laid out my feelings on this one right here at the front, so if you want to just click off this video, I really don't blame you. But don't do that because I need the views. We start off the issue as we have the two previous issues. A wall of text and a recap of the previous issue greets us as we open up. Well, points for consistency at the very least. And we start the comic proper with Sally, Dylan, and Hamlin already deep in the facility, shooting down SWAT bots as they make their way towards the central control room. I'd just like to say that this one is a hell of a lot larger than the last three facilities they blew up, and the sensitive stuff is a whole lot better defended. Congrats on that, Robotnik, you actually presented a challenge to them this time. They somehow managed to get by using nothing but weird red goop, but once again, Hamlin becomes our dumbass in distress, almost falling off the side of a crumbling catwalk and getting shot out by a SWAT bot with unusually impeccable aim, but a really slow trigger finger. Sally, of course, manages to pull him back up just in time, and the three make their way to the inner sanctum to really wreck shit, only to be confronted by Robotnik and Jeffrey St. John waiting for them. Hamlin states the obvious, calling out Jeffrey for being a traitor and immediately lunges at him, taking him to the ground. Sally, however, turns her weirdly useful slingshot on Hamlin, and we get the big reveal that this Sally is little more than an infiltrator robot, and that the energy substations were just an elaborate ruse to test this out and capture Princess Sally. So, Robotnik, buddy, why did you go through this whole elaborate ruse, resulting in the destruction of several of your facilities, real or fake, and the loss of several robotic guards, rather than having your infiltrator bot just kill them after the swap? Oh right, you're an idiot who enjoys gloating over everything else. I will give the comic credit for this. As stupid and convoluted as the plan is, I do think it fits with Robotnik's character as a great big egomaniac. He's driven by a need to not only crush those that oppose him, but to also look them in the eye and break their spirit so that they know that he's beaten them, utterly and totally. Doesn't really excuse the incredibly stupid and convoluted way he went about doing it, and he could have just lured them into this one specific facility, but at least it's keeping true to his character as a sadistic megalomaniac fueled by his own ego and greed. And just to try and make sure that they are so completely broken, Robotnik plugs Sally's pod into a machine next to him and sets it to roboticize her right away. However, something goes wrong during the process and the whole thing ends up going kablooey. This confuses Robotnik, as something like that shouldn't happen unless the subject inside the roboticizer is already a robot. And sure enough, we get the next big reveal that the Sally we've been following was the real Sally, and that the one that St. John ran off with in the previous issue was actually the fake Sally, and the real Sally had been stashed in the tube prior to this, so that the fake would tell them Robotnik's plan, or rather the plan that he gave the fake Sally to feed to the freedom fighters to lure them into the situation because Jeffrey wasn't actually a double agent, but a pseudo-double agent who was actually loyal to Sally and—
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
Credit where credit is due. As convoluted as the overall story is, at the very least, I didn't see this particular double-cross coming when I first read the story. I mean, I always suspected Jeffrey to turn good, but the reveal of him always being on Sally's side and helping her from behind the scenes is at least a little surprising. We'll just ignore the fact that Sally was still willing to put her life in the hands of a total stranger she just met, was willing to put the fates of her teammates in his hands as well, was trusting that the infiltration bot wouldn't go through any sort of attempted assassinations while they slept, was willing to trust that nothing happened to her while she was in that weird pod. Jeez Louise, even when the story does something semi-interesting, it still manages to open up another can of stupid. Sally has Robotnik on the business end of her slingshot, but the large robots lining the walls suddenly come alive. And just when it looks like the dictator might have the upper hand, Jeffrey reminds us that he's the leader of his own team of freedom fighters, the Rebel Underground, who just so happen to have a giant tunneling machine that comes up right through the ground and starts shooting those robots up. And hey, wouldn't you know it, those two useless characters we abandoned in the last issue have come back with the Underground. Even though that doesn't really matter at all, because it's not like they warned the Underground what was going on, they just hid with them until this exact moment, so that whole mystery of them going missing was entirely pointless and did very little for them as characters. Hell, it didn't even do anything for us as readers because we had no connection to them to begin with. The Resistance fighters make quick work of the great big robots, and then Sally roundhouse kicks Robotnik in a scene that should be a hell of a lot more satisfying than it is. But, of course, nobody thinks to actually restrain him, and while they're all celebrating, the dictator jumps up, activates a self-destruct sequence, and then disappears through a hidden tube in the ground. Of course, all of our heroes quickly dash out to a vehicle docking bay, swipe some flying saucers, and fly off just as the facility goes boom. Sally seems convinced that Robotnik won't be making any more duplicate robots, since the facility they blew up was also apparently the manufacturing plant, and of course no one brings up the fact that there could be more facilities doing the same thing, or that Robotnik might still have blueprints or a backup file of her personality, but let's not worry about actually important facts, we have an awards ceremony to get to here. Sally officially inducts her 4 teammates into the Freedom Fighter fold, which means nothing because these guys aren't going to be showing up again for a long, long time. At least not in any sort of big capacity. And then, if you haven't realized what's going on at this point, the next 4 pages are nothing but a full recap of exactly what the hell was going on through this whole miniseries. Just a slight suggestion coming from a guy who reads a lot of these comics: if you have to explain all of the plot twists and plot points of your arc in an exposition dump in the last issue of the arc, you might want to examine your story structure a little bit more. And the next morning, Jeffrey and Sally say their goodbyes, and they share a passionate kiss as Sally laments that where once there was only one in her heart, there is now 2. What was the point of this mini? I mean, seriously, answer me this. What was the point? Usually for a miniseries or a micro issue, the idea is to take a character or idea from the main series and expand upon it, examine it, show off their strengths or flaws, find out what makes them tick, and maybe help make them stronger characters as a result. Now and then, ideas or events from the mini may spill over into the main book, but more often than not, the events are just mentioned in passing or completely ignored. But there's the big problem with this. Things from this mini will appear in later issues, but in the worst way. The story was boring, convoluted, and had very little substance to it, especially when it comes to Sally, who despite being the main character of the mini, and granted she's a lot more proactive than most of the other characters, she doesn't learn anything or grow any as a character. Instead, the biggest immediate changes that were brought on by this miniseries were the introductions of the Infiltrators, an idea that would be revisited sporadically over the series' lifetime, and Jeffrey, a pet character for Kid Penders, who I find very little to like about in this story, as he's presented as a soldier version of Pepe Le Pew, and who becomes a romantic rival with Sonic for Sally's affections. And thus begins the very first romantic plot tumor, a theme that would continue well into the series, much to my chagrin. And I hate how it's introduced here. Sonic and Sally have always had this sort of playful on-again, off-again way of toying with one another in terms of their romantic relationship, and in the comic to this point, we haven't really gotten a whole lot out of their relationship, aside from some playful teasing here and there. It's not like in the cartoon, where their relationship was made a lot more obvious and overt. But then along comes Jeffrey, who she knows for upwards of 3 days, most of which she's spent in a freaking pod, and she's perfectly willing to act like she's known him for years. I'm not gonna make a whole thing about who should be shipped with who, because in the grand scheme of things it doesn't matter, but this was a very obvious attempt at trying to force romantic tension into a place where it wasn't needed. And as a consequence, this was basically the beginning of the end for anything resembling an alpha couple in the comic. If I had to give a positive, it does feel like the art got a little bit better by the end of the story. Not a whole lot better, but not nearly as off-putting as some of the designs in the first issue. So good on Art Mawhinney for that, but it definitely doesn't help the story that much. At this point, I'm just glad to be leaving this behind. There are other minis for the series, and we'll get to them as they pop up, but I'll say right now, to my knowledge, none of them get nearly as bad as this one, in that they actually have a bit of a point to them. For now, let's hop back into the main book where we're not quite done with the whole evil duplicate shtick just yet, as we enter issue 24. I'll see you all there.